Did you know the US military fired 1,400 rounds at a UFO over Los Angeles? A 500-pound bear was officially enlisted as a soldier, and a Navy blimp landed in California with its crew completely erased from existence? From Nazi space mirrors to the spy who was already dead, we're uncovering 111 insane World War II mysteries that science and history still can't explain. Stick around and hit subscribe, because the number 46 mystery will absolutely blow your mind. 1. Imagine a giant floating helium sausage crashing right into a suburban street in Daly City, California, and scaring the living daylights out of everyone. This actually happened in 1942 when a US Navy blimp just drifted inland and smashed into a house. The weirdest part was that the engines were running and the radio worked perfectly. Some bystanders rushed to help the pilots, but the cabin was totally empty like a spooky ghost ship. The parachutes were still there, and the life raft was untouched. Americans were baffled and panicked, thinking invisible aliens snatched the crew. To this day, nobody knows where those two pilots went, and the Navy just shrugged. 2. The US military had the absolute brightest idea to defeat Japan by recruiting thousands of Mexican free-tailed bats as tiny kamikaze pilots. A dentist convinced the president that bats could carry mini napalm bombs and roost in the wooden attics of Japanese cities to burn them down. They actually spent $2 million catching bats and cooling them down so they would sleep while getting strapped with explosives. The testing went terribly wrong when the armed bats woke up early and flew away to burn down the US Army base instead. It was a chaotic, flaming disaster that proved nature really hates being weaponized by Uncle Sam. 3. Imagine walking into a room that is literally made of straight-up gold and shiny amber panels worth $500 million. The Russian czars had this fancy chamber until the Nazis showed up in 1941 and decided they wanted it for their own clubhouse. They packed the entire room into 27 crates and shipped it to a castle in Germany, where it sat until the war ended. But when the Allies arrived to take it back, the whole room had just vanished into thin air. Treasure hunters have spent decades looking for it, but nobody has found a single piece. Maybe it is sitting in some grandpa's basement right now. 4. British spies pulled off the ultimate weekend at Bernie's prank to fool the entire German army. They took a homeless man who had died in London and dressed his corpse up as a fancy officer named Major Martin. They handcuffed a briefcase with fake invasion plans to his wrist and floated him off the coast of Spain. The Nazis found the body and totally fell for the trick, believing every single word of the fake documents. Hitler moved his tanks to the wrong country while the Allies invaded Sicily without any trouble. It was the only time in history a dead guy won a massive battle for the living. 5. You might think your buddies are tough, but the Polish army actually enlisted a 500-pound Syrian brown bear named Wojtek. This was not a mascot, because they gave him an official rank and a pay book, and even ration coupons for cigarettes which he ate. During the brutal Battle of Monte Cassino, this furry soldier actually carried heavy crates of artillery shells that normal men could not lift. He never dropped a single crate, even with bombs exploding all around him. After the war, he retired to a zoo in Scotland where he lived like a hero. It turns out the right to bear arms was meant literally. 6. Los Angeles residents completely lost their minds one night in 1942 and started a massive war against absolutely nothing. Air raid sirens screamed, and the military fired over 1,400 heavy anti-aircraft shells into the dark sky at a mysterious object. People claimed they saw a giant UFO hovering over the city while soldiers kept blasting away for hours. The next morning, there was zero wreckage, and the Japanese Navy confirmed they were nowhere near California. The government claimed it was just a weather balloon, which is the classic excuse for aliens. We basically declared war on a cloud, and the cloud actually won. 7. The Nazis were apparently trying to build a literal Death Star to roast Americans alive from outer space. Allied troops discovered terrifying diagrams for a giant orbital mirror that was a mile wide and meant to harness the power of the sun. The plan was to float this glass nightmare into orbit and focus a beam of pure heat onto cities like Pittsburgh or New York to boil the ocean. It sounds like a bad comic book plot, but German scientists were dead serious about frying us like ants under a magnifying glass. Thankfully, they lost the war before they could start roasting our marshmallows. 8. There is a legend that a Japanese general hid billions of dollars in stolen gold Inside secret tunnels in the Philippines. General Yamashita looted banks across Asia and buried the treasure deep underground, protected by deadly booby traps and sealed with concrete. Some people say the tunnels are still full of gold bars and diamonds waiting for a lucky digger to find them. The craziest rumor is that the treasure was actually found by a locksmith who was then tortured by the government to give it up. People are still destroying the jungle today, hoping to stumble upon the ultimate pirate jackpot. 9. The US Army recruited a bunch of art school students and gave them inflatable rubber tanks to trick the Germans. This secret unit used giant speakers to blast sound effects of moving trucks and soldiers to fake out the enemy. They would set up dummy tanks in a field and pretend to be a massive division while the real army attacked somewhere else. The Germans wasted their ammo blowing up balloons, while the artists laughed from the bushes. It was the biggest tactical bluff in military history and proved that being a theater nerd can actually save lives during a world war. 10. Modern warfare usually involves machine guns, but a British legend named Mad Jack Churchill decided to fight Nazis with a longbow and a sword. He literally stormed the beaches of Normandy, playing the bagpipes and carrying a basket of grenades like a medieval knight. He is the only soldier confirmed to have killed a German enemy with a bow and arrow during the entire war. When he was captured, he was bored, so he just walked out of the prison camp. He famously said any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed, which is just hilariously insane. 11. American pilots flying night missions started freaking out because glowing red balls of light were following them everywhere. These weird orbs danced around the wings and outran the fastest planes we had, which terrified the guys in the cockpit. The pilots called them Foo Fighters and thought they were secret Nazi weapons ready to blow them up. But the Germans saw them too and thought they were American weapons. Scientists still have absolutely no clue what they were even 80 years later. It sounds like aliens were taking a front row seat to watch us fight. Maybe they just wanted to see who would win the war. 12. You might think pigeons are just rats with wings, but the US military tried to turn them into precision missile guidance systems. A famous psychologist named B.F. Skinner trained 3 pigeons to peck at a little screen inside the nose of a missile to steer it. The birds would see an enemy ship through a lens and peck furiously to keep the bomb on target until it exploded. The generals watched the demonstration and just laughed because the idea of bird-brained pilots was too ridiculous. They canceled the project because nobody wanted to trust a nuclear weapon to a hungry bird wanting seeds. 13. There is a wild local legend in Poland that a massive armored train full of Nazi gold is buried right under our feet. People say that in the final days of the war, the panicked Nazis loaded 300 tons of gold and jewels onto a train and drove it into a mountain tunnel. They supposedly collapsed the entrance and killed the workers to keep the location a secret forever. Treasure hunters with ground-penetrating radar went crazy a few years ago, claiming they found it. But after digging a huge hole, they found absolutely nothing but dirt and disappointment. The ghost train remains hidden. 14. The American spies at the OSS decided the best way to mess with Hitler was to become the world's most annoying mailman. They created millions of fake stamps that looked real, but had a picture of a skull instead of the Führer. They bombed mail trains and dropped bags of this fake mail so the confused German postal service would pick it up and deliver it. Every German citizen opened their morning mail to find anti-Nazi propaganda delivered right to their breakfast table by their own government. It was the ultimate troll move to make Hitler look like a total joke to his people. 15. Cats supposedly have 9 lives, but this black and white cat named Sam definitely used up all of his luck during the war. He started on the giant German battleship Bismarck, which sank in a huge fireball, but Sam was found floating on a board. The British rescued him and put him on their own ship, which was also torpedoed and sank a few months later. Sam survived again and went to a third ship which was also destroyed by a torpedo. Sailors eventually decided Sam was bad luck and banned him from the ocean forever. He lived the rest of his life chasing mice on land. 16. Radar operators in Hawaii nearly had a heart attack a year after Pearl Harbor when they saw a single plane coming from Japan. 2 pilots flew up to intercept it and saw an American P-40 fighter that looked like it had been through a meat grinder. The landing gear was gone, and the pilot was slumped over covered in fresh blood. The plane crashed into a field, and when rescuers ran to the wreckage, the cockpit was completely empty. There was no body and no sign of where the pilot went. It was a ghost plane returning from the dead for one last landing. 17. The British military built a giant rolling wheel of death that looked like two massive wagon wheels filled with explosive rockets. The idea was for this terrifying device to speed up the beach and smash through thick concrete walls. But during the big test in front of all the top generals, the rockets misfired and the wheel went rogue. It chased a cameraman into the ocean and nearly ran over a dog, while the generals ran for their lives in panic. The entire project was scrapped because the weapon was more dangerous to the British Army than it ever was to the confused Germans. 18. An American submarine captain made a huge mistake and torpedoed a Japanese ship that was actually carrying $5 billion in loot. The Awamaru was loaded with gold and diamonds and rare resources that Japan had stolen from other countries during the war. The ship sank in minutes and took almost all the treasure down to the bottom of the ocean. The United States actually had to apologize for sinking it, but nobody has ever recovered the main vault. Somewhere in the dark water, there is a fortune in diamonds just waiting for someone brave enough to dive down and grab it. 19. Security officers in London went into full panic mode just days before D-Day because of a simple newspaper crossword puzzle. The Daily Telegraph puzzle suddenly included top-secret code words like Omaha and Neptune, which were the actual names for the invasion beaches. The military was convinced that the crossword creator was a German super spy, signaling Hitler about the attack. They arrested the poor guy who was just a school headmaster and interrogated him for hours. It turned out to be a massive coincidence, or maybe the students he listened to were psychic. We still do not know how he guessed the biggest secret. 20. History gets really weird when you find out that American soldiers and German soldiers actually teamed up to fight together. It happened at a castle in Austria where important French prisoners were being held hostage by the fanatical SS troops. The regular German army guys did not want the prisoners to die, so they grabbed their guns and stood next to the Americans. They fought side by side against the SS in a chaotic battle that looked like a movie script. It was the only time the enemies became best friends to save the day, and it proves that war is totally unpredictable. 21. If you are afraid of the ocean, then this story about the Bermuda Triangle will definitely make you never swim again. 5 American torpedo bombers took off from Florida for a routine training flight when everything went totally wrong. The flight leader started screaming that his compasses were broken and the ocean looked weird. Then, all 5 planes just vanished without a single trace. The Navy sent a rescue plane with 13 guys to find them, and that plane exploded and disappeared too. It was like the ocean just opened up and ate 27 men in one afternoon. To this day, nobody has found a single piece of wreckage, which makes everyone think aliens are hungry. 22. German scientists got bored of shooting bullets, so they decided to build a cannon that shot invisible tornadoes. They designed a weird-looking tube called the wind cannon that used explosions to fire a plug of compressed air. The idea was to knock Allied planes out of the sky by hitting them with a sudden blast of wind that would snap their wings off. They tested it on wooden boards, and it actually shattered them into pieces. But when they tried to use it in real life, the air just fizzled out before hitting anything. It was basically the world's most expensive and useless leaf blower. 23. Everyone loves a good pirate story, but this one involves a Nazi general and a hidden fortune near a beautiful island. The famous desert fox named Rommel allegedly stole 4 heavy crates of pure gold and jewels during his campaigns in Africa. Legend says his men dumped the treasure into the sea off the coast of Corsica to keep it safe. The coordinates were supposedly tattooed or written on the back of a soldier who later died. Treasure hunters and divers have spent years searching the blue water, but nobody has found the loot. That gold is still sitting there waiting for someone with a scuba tank. 24. The French government came up with a plan so crazy that it sounds like a cartoon plot to save their capital. They wanted to build a completely fake version of Paris a few miles away to trick German bombers at night. They planned to use wooden buildings and fancy electric lights to mimic the train stations and famous landmarks. The goal was for the pilots to drop their bombs on the fake city and blow up a bunch of empty fields instead of the Louvre. The war ended before they could finish it, but imagine the look on the pilots' faces if they bombed a plywood city. 25. The Nazis were terrified of a group of Soviet pilots who were all women and flew planes made of plywood and canvas. These brave ladies flew missions at night and had a terrifying trick to stay invisible. They would cut their engines and glide silently over the German trenches before dropping their bombs. The only sound the soldiers heard was the wind whistling through the wires, which sounded like a witch on a broomstick. The Germans were so scared they promised an Iron Cross medal to anyone who could shoot one down. These flying ladies proved that silence is actually the deadliest weapon of them all. 26. Kids playing in the woods in England found something that is straight out of a horror movie nightmare. They looked inside a hollow tree and found a human skull staring right back at them. Police found a full skeleton of a woman shoved inside the trunk, but nobody knew who she was. Then, mysterious graffiti started appearing all over the town, asking who put Bella in the witch elm. It happened for decades and nobody ever caught the graffiti artist or identified the woman. Some say she was a German spy who parachuted in and got caught by locals who decided to turn her into tree fertilizer. 27. Hitler loved big things, but his plan for a land battleship was completely off the charts ridiculous. He approved a design for a tank called the Ratte that would have weighed 1,000 tons. It was going to be so heavy that it would crush every road and bridge it tried to cross. It was basically a destroyer ship on tracks with guns as big as a house. The engineers were too scared to tell him it was physically impossible to move. Thankfully, the war ended before they could build it because it would have just sunk into the mud and stayed there forever. 28. There is a scenic lake in the Austrian Alps that is hiding a very dark and expensive secret at the bottom. As the war ended, panicked, Nazis dumped boxes of counterfeit British pounds and secret documents into the deep water. They wanted to hide the evidence of their plan to crash the British economy with fake cash. Many divers have gone down there to look for the rest of the gold, but several have died in mysterious accidents. The lake is full of sunken logs and tangled debris that traps people. It seems like the Nazis left a curse behind to protect their soggy stolen money. 29. The British were running out of steel, so they decided to build an aircraft carrier out of ice and wood pulp. They called the material pykrete, and it was actually harder than concrete and took forever to melt. They wanted to make a floating island that was 2,000 feet long and totally unsinkable. They even brought a block of it to a meeting and shot it with a pistol to prove it was tough. The bullet bounced off and almost hit an admiral in the leg. They eventually realized that a giant ice cube needs a lot of freezers to keep from turning into a puddle. 30. Imagine being so stubborn that you keep fighting a war for 29 years after it actually ended. A Japanese soldier named Hiru Onoda hid in the Philippine jungle and refused to believe the surrender news was real. He thought the leaflets dropped by planes were just American lies to trick him. He lived off bananas and stolen cows and shot at local farmers who came too close. His old commander had to fly out in 1974 to order him to finally put down his rifle. He walked out of the jungle wearing his tattered uniform, ready for a battle that was already history. 31. French sailors were incredibly proud of the Surcouf because it was the biggest submarine monster in the world at the time. It was basically an underwater cruiser with huge guns and even a tiny hangar for a seaplane. But in 1942, this massive steel beast just vanished completely while sailing to the Panama Canal with 130 men. The official story is a collision with an American merchant ship, but the damage on that ship was too small. Conspiracy theorists think an American plane sank it by mistake, or the Bermuda Triangle just swallowed it whole. It remains one of the largest mysteries deep under the sea. 32. German soldiers wanted to shoot their enemies without ever poking their heads out of safety, so they bent the laws of physics. They invented a curved rifle barrel called the Krummlauf that was bent at 30 degrees to shoot around corners. It came with a little periscope mirror, so the soldier could see where he was aiming while hiding behind a wall. The problem was that bullets hate going in circles, and the high pressure often shattered the barrel into jagged metal. It was a cartoon idea brought to life that was actually more dangerous to the shooter than the guy he was trying to hit. 33. You would think we would take better care of our own ancestors, but apparently, war ruins everything, including history. The Peking man fossils were some of the most important ancient human bones ever found, and proved how we evolved. To save them from the invading Japanese army, the Marines packed them onto a ship to send them to America. But in the chaos of the attack, the ship was captured and the fossils completely disappeared. Nobody knows if they were ground up for medicine or are sitting in a box in Japan. We literally lost the first guy to ever walk upright. 34. The real-life inspiration for James Bond was a smooth-talking spy named Dusko Popov, who loved casinos and women. He actually uncovered the Japanese plan to attack Pearl Harbor months before it happened and took the proof to the FBI. But the FBI boss J. Edgar Hoover was a grumpy old man who hated Popov because of his wild partying lifestyle. Hoover ignored the warning completely and called the spy a moral degenerate instead of listening to him. If the FBI director had just been a little more fun at parties, he might have saved thousands of American lives and stopped a war. 35. The U.S. Navy has done some embarrassing things, but nothing tops the time they almost assassinated their own president. A destroyer called the William D. Porter was running a drill while escorting President Roosevelt across the Atlantic Ocean. The crew accidentally fired a live armed torpedo directly at the battleship, carrying the leader of the free world. The panic was absolute chaos as they radioed the other ship to look out for the underwater missile. The torpedo exploded just behind the ship, and the entire crew was arrested immediately. It is the only time we almost declared war on ourselves. 36. Raoul Wallenberg was a Swedish superhero who didn't wear a cape but saved tens of thousands of lives in Hungary. He handed out fake passports and set up safe houses to protect Jewish families from the Nazis. But when the Soviet army arrived to liberate the city, they arrested him for absolutely no reason. He vanished into the dark and brutal Russian prison system and was never seen freely again. The Soviets lied for decades about how he died, claiming a heart attack or execution. It is a tragic mystery how a man who saved so many could just be erased by his own allies. 37. The Nazis tried to kill Winston Churchill with a weapon that sounds delicious but was actually deadly. German bomb makers created steel explosives that were covered in a thin layer of rich dark chocolate. The plan was to wrap them in fancy gold foil and smuggle them into the dining room of the British government. They hoped a hungry general or Churchill himself would crack one open and get blown up by dessert. British spies discovered the plot just in time and warned everyone to stop eating random candy bars. It gives a whole new meaning to the phrase death by chocolate. 38. As the Allied armies marched into Germany, they were terrified of a secret final base called the Alpine Fortress. Intelligence reports claimed the Nazis had hollowed out giant mountains in Bavaria to build an impenetrable underground city. Generals feared the war would drag on for years as they fought tunnel by tunnel against fanatical troops. It turned out to be a massive bluff because the fortress was mostly just propaganda and empty caves. However, rumors persist that trucks filled with gold and stolen art were driven into those mountains and sealed up. The treasure might still be sitting in the dark, waiting for a map. 39. The British spy agency SOE made a catastrophic mistake that got dozens of brave agents captured and killed. The Germans captured a Dutch radio operator and forced him to send messages back to London pretending he was still free. The British ignored all the safety checks and kept sending new spies and weapons directly to the drop zones the Germans chose. For 2 years, the Nazis were there to welcome the agents with handcuffs and a prison cell. It was called Operation North Pole, and it was a humiliating disaster where the British basically delivered their own soldiers to the enemy on a silver platter. 40. Some people have bad luck, but Tsutomu Yamaguchi had the most terrifying luck in human history. He was in Hiroshima on a business trip when the first atomic bomb exploded and burned him badly. He survived the blast and dragged himself to the train station to go home to Nagasaki. 3 days later, he was telling his boss about the mushroom cloud when the second atomic bomb dropped right on top of him. He is the only person officially recognized to have survived 2 nuclear explosions in 1 week. The universe tried to delete him twice, but he just refused to go. 41. If you ever visit the Philippines and want to pee your pants, check out the Diplomat Hotel. During the war, this place was a refuge that turned into a horror show when Japanese soldiers invaded and committed terrible acts. It is now considered the most haunted ruin in all of Asia, where visitors constantly report seeing headless ghosts. People hear screaming at night and see doors banging open when nobody is there to touch them. Locals refuse to walk past it after the sun goes down because the spirits seem totally trapped in the walls. It is basically a real-life haunted house that you can actually visit if you are brave enough. 42. The Nazis really loved giant guns, and the V3 was the biggest and craziest one they ever designed. They built a massive supergun right into the side of a hill in France aimed directly at London. The barrel was over 400 feet long and used multiple explosions to speed up the shell like a sci-fi railgun. The plan was to rain down explosive shells on the British capital every hour from 100 miles away. Thankfully, American bombers flew over and smashed the site into gravel before it could fire a single shot. It was a cartoonish weapon that would have been terrifying if it actually worked. 43. You might think pirates and Nazis belong in different movies, but they actually crossed paths in a weird way. Allied soldiers searching a German bunker found a mysterious coded map that supposedly belonged to the legendary Captain Kidd. Conspiracy theorists believe that top Nazi leaders were obsessed with finding this lost pirate treasure to fund their war machine. They thought digging up chests of Spanish gold would save their crumbling economy and buy more tanks. Nobody knows if they ever found the X that marks the spot, or if they just wasted time digging holes. It is the crossover episode of history that nobody asked for but everyone wants. 44. The Japanese military was famous for cracking every single code the Americans used until the Marines brought in the Navajo. These Native American heroes used their complex native language to talk on the radio, and the Japanese were completely baffled. The enemy intelligence officers listened for hours and could not understand a single syllable because it sounded like gibberish to them. They called a grenade a potato and a tank a turtle, which is just hilarious and brilliant. It remains the only oral military code in history that was never deciphered. The Marines basically won the war by speaking a language that belonged to America all along. 45. Most soldiers fight for one country, but this Korean guy named Yang Kyung-jong accidentally collected uniforms like Pokemon. He was first drafted by the Japanese army to fight the Soviets, but was captured and forced to fight for the Red Army. Then the Germans captured him and forced him to fight for the Nazis in France. Finally, he was captured by American paratroopers on D-Day, who were confused why a Korean guy was wearing a German uniform. He is the only soldier in history to fight for 3 different massive armies in one war. He moved to Illinois afterwards, probably because he was sick of changing his clothes. 46. An American bomber crew got lost in a sandstorm over Libya and vanished into the desert night without a trace. Everyone assumed they crashed in the sea, but 15 years later an oil team found the plane sitting on the sand. The Lady Be Good was perfectly preserved with water bottles still full and the radio still working. The weirdest part was that there were no bodies inside the plane or anywhere near the wreckage. The crew had bailed out and tried to walk to safety but died one by one in the heat. It is a haunting ghost ship story that happened in the middle of a dry ocean. 47. The Nazis built thousands of remote-controlled mini-tanks that looked like cute little toys but were actually deadly bombs. These things were called Goliaths and were steered by a soldier holding a joystick connected by a long wire. They were designed to drive under Allied tanks or into bridges and explode with a massive bang. The problem was that the wire would get cut by debris, or the little tank would get stuck in a pothole. Allied soldiers used to shoot them for target practice or just cut the wire and steal them. It was the first time in history that war felt like a dangerous video game. 48. Prisoners at a brutal camp in Belgium whispered rumors that the guards were burying stolen fortune in the dirt. They claimed that the Nazis forced inmates to dig holes and hide boxes filled with diamonds and gold jewelry. After the war ended, treasure hunters and former prisoners grabbed shovels and turned the entire place upside down. They dug up the courtyard and the fields around the fort, hoping to find the glittering stash. Sadly, they found absolutely nothing except dirt and old rusty metal. The legend of the buried diamonds persists today, but it seems the Nazis were smart enough to take the loot with them when they ran. 49. Imagine driving your Jeep down a road in France and seeing a stop sign that points the wrong way. German commandos dressed up in stolen American uniforms and drove U.S. Army Jeeps behind the front lines to cause chaos. They spoke perfect English and spent their days switching road signs to send Allied convoys into swamps. It caused such a massive panic that American soldiers started quizzing each other on baseball stats to prove they were real. Even a general was arrested for hours because he didn't know the winner of the World Series. It was a prank war that actually worked and totally confused the entire army. 50. A soccer team made up of starving Ukrainian prisoners played the most high-stakes game in the history of sports. They were challenged to a match against a team of healthy and well-fed Nazi officers in occupied Kyiv. The players knew that if they won the game, they would likely be executed for humiliating the German master race. Despite being weak and threatened with guns, they played their hearts out and crushed the Nazis 5-3. It was a massive victory for morale, but tragically, many of the players were arrested and killed soon after. They chose dignity over safety and became legends of the beautiful game. 51. You would expect a submarine to surrender when the war is over, but U-534 decided to run for it. This German U-boat ignored the order to give up in 1945 and sped away toward Norway until the British Air Force sank it. It sat on the bottom of the ocean for 48 years until treasure hunters raised it in 1993, hoping for gold. They cracked open the rusty hatch and found absolutely zero treasure inside, just some high-tech torpedoes and condoms. It is a total mystery why the captain risked his entire crew to save a boat full of rubber and old sandwiches from the winning allies. 52. German scientists apparently got bored of regular guns and tried to build a weapon that could kill people with a bass drop. They created a bizarre machine called the sound cannon, which used a combustion chamber to fire shockwaves of compressed methane gas. The goal was to vibrate an enemy soldier so hard that their insides would turn to jelly from the noise. They tested it on animals but realized it only worked if you were standing fewer than 50 yards away. It was basically the world's loudest and most useless speaker system that was more likely to give you a headache than actually win a war. 53. Imagine losing a painting that is worth more than most private islands because you were too busy looting everything else. The Nazis stole a priceless portrait by Raphael from a museum in Poland and hung it in the home of a high-ranking governor. It was considered the most important painting missing since the war started and was worth over $100 million today. When the governor tried to run away from the approaching Russians, the painting just vanished into thin air. A soldier probably stole it or it burned up, but somewhere out there a masterpiece might be sitting in a dirty attic collecting dust. 54. Juan Pujol. Garcia was the greatest liar in human history, and he tricked the Nazis without even leaving his house. He pretended to be a fanatical pro-Nazi spy running a network of 27 agents in England, but he made them all up. He sent fake reports to Hitler using a tourist guidebook and a map he bought at a library. The Germans believed him so much that Hitler personally awarded him the Iron Cross for his service. The British loved him too and gave him a medal for fooling the Germans. He is the only man to get medals from both sides for lying. 55. Your favorite orange soda actually has a really dark origin story that starts right in the middle of Nazi Germany. The Coca-Cola company could not ship their secret syrup ingredients to their German factories because of the trade embargoes. So the local boss decided to make a new drink using the garbage leftovers from other food industries like apple fiber and cheese whey. He called it Fanta because it came from his fantasy, and the Germans loved the sweet trash water. It became the official drink of the Nazi Party simply because they could not get a classic Coke to sip while losing the war. 56. Glenn Miller was basically the rock star of the 1940s until he vanished into the clouds forever. The famous band leader boarded a small plane to fly from England to Paris to play a concert for the troops. The plane took off into the fog and never arrived at the destination, and no wreckage was ever found. Some theories say his plane froze up in the bad weather, while others think British bombers accidentally dropped their payload on him from above. It is a tragic mystery that the music died that day, and we still do not know where the plane went down in the cold water. 57. British engineers looked at a Jeep and decided it would be much cooler if it could fly like a helicopter. They attached a giant rotor blade and a tail fin to a standard army Jeep and towed it behind a bomber plane. The idea was to drag the Jeep into the air and let it glide down to the battlefield with the soldiers already inside. It actually flew during testing, but it wobbled terrifyingly, and the pilot nearly had a heart attack trying to control it. They eventually realized that just driving the Jeep on the ground was probably a safer way to get to work. 58. There was a train loaded with the entire gold reserve of Hungary plus stolen Jewish treasures worth $200 million. The train was heading toward Germany when American soldiers intercepted it and seized the massive fortune. But instead of returning the loot to the rightful owners, the U.S. generals started treating the train like a shopping mall. They requisitioned paintings and china and gold for their own officers' clubs and personal homes. Most of the treasure just disappeared into the pockets of the liberators, which is a huge scandal. It turns out that findingers keepers was the official policy of the U.S. Army that year. 59. Before she was teaching Americans how to cook delicious French food on television, Julia Child was actually a top-secret spy. She worked for the OSS, which was the predecessor to the CIA, and she had a very weird mission. Her job was to cook up a recipe for shark repellent because curious sharks kept bumping into underwater explosives meant for German submarines. She mixed copper acetate and black dye to create a cake that smelled like dead sharks to scare them away. It is hilarious that her first famous recipe was actually designed to make sharks vomit instead of making people hungry for dinner. 60. The movie made it look like a fun adventure, but the real Great Escape was actually a tragic disaster. 76 Allied prisoners crawled through a tunnel named Harry, hoping to reach the safety of the dark forest. But the tunnel was too short and they popped up right in front of a guard tower and were spotted. Only 3 men actually made it to safety and freedom, while everyone else was recaptured immediately. Hitler was so furious about the embarrassment that he ordered the execution of 50 of the escapers. It was a brave attempt that ended in a massacre rather than a Hollywood ending. 61. Imagine a secret Nazi science project that wasn't a gun, but a giant metal bell that hummed. They called it Die Glock and built it in a spooky concrete ring in Poland. Scientists said it spun 2 cylinders of purple liquid called red mercury that killed plants and made people vomit blood just by standing near it. Rumors say it was an anti-gravity engine or maybe a time machine to fix their mistakes. But right before the Russians arrived, the bell and the general in charge completely vanished. Maybe they flew to the moon, or maybe they just vaporized themselves into another dimension. 62. Japan realized they couldn't fly planes to America, so they decided to mail us bombs using paper balloons. They launched 9,000 hydrogen balloons into the jet stream, hoping they would drift across the ocean and burn down our forests. Most of them fell in the ocean or just got lost, but a few actually made it to Oregon. Tragically, a Sunday school teacher and 5 kids found one on a picnic, and it exploded. It was the only time enemy attacks killed civilians on the mainland, and it started with a paper science project that actually worked way too well. 63. Heinrich Himmler was the second most powerful Nazi, but he was basically a nerdy fanboy for magic artifacts. He actually traveled to a monastery in Spain called Montserrat because he thought the Holy Grail was hiding there. He seriously believed that finding the cup of Jesus would give the Nazis superpowers to win the war. The monks just stared at him like he was crazy and told him they didn't have it. He left empty-handed and disappointed that real life isn't an Indiana Jones movie. It is hilarious to think evil generals were chasing fairy tales while losing a real war. 64. Hitler sent a team of 8 saboteurs in a submarine to land on the beaches of Florida and New York. Their mission was to blow up factories and railroads and cause total panic in America. By the end of the war, they had caught or turned every single German agent in the country. They didn't just arrest them, but forced them to send radio messages back to Germany full of total lies. The Nazis thought they had a massive network of spies, but they were just talking to the British government. It is hilarious that Hitler was making huge military decisions based on fan fiction written by British agents. We literally controlled their eyes and ears for years. 65. He was fixing teeth in a tent on Saipan when thousands of Japanese soldiers attacked his hospital. He told his patients to run and grabbed a heavy machine gun to hold off the entire enemy army by himself. He fought like an absolute demon for hours to buy time for the wounded to escape. When they found his body the next day, he had been shot 70 times but was surrounded by 98 dead enemies. He turned a dental checkup into a legendary last stand. 66. Imagine if the vice president just stole a jet and flew to Russia without telling anyone. That is exactly what Rudolf Hess did when he flew a fighter plane to Scotland in 1941. He parachuted into a field and told a farmer with a pitchfork that he wanted to make peace with Britain. Hitler went crazy and called him a lunatic, while the British just threw him in jail for life. Historians still argue if he was actually a body double or if he was tricked by spies. It remains the weirdest solo road trip that a top government official has ever taken. 67. German engineers had a serious obsession with making things way too big to actually function properly. They built a super tank called the Maus, which weighed 188 tons. It was the heaviest armored vehicle ever built and looked like a moving fortress of steel doom. The only problem was that it was so heavy, it would destroy any bridge it tried to cross. It chugged along at like 8 miles per hour and eventually just broke down. The Germans had to blow it up themselves so the Russians wouldn't get it. It was a giant metal paperweight. 68. The Nazis had a creepy sacred flag that they treated like a religious artifact from a dark cult. It was stained with the blood of the Nazis who died during Hitler's first failed attempt to take over Germany. Hitler used to touch other flags with this bloody cloth to sanctify them at their massive rallies. It was last seen in public in 1944 before the chaos of the final battles began. Nobody knows if it was burned in an air raid or if some American soldier stole it as a souvenir. It is the most evil missing blanket in history. 69. The British intelligence agency MI5 pulled off a perfect score in the game of spy versus spy. By the end of the war, they had caught or turned every single German agent in the country. They didn't just arrest them, but forced them to send radio messages back to Germany full of total lies. The Nazis thought they had a massive network of spies, but they were just talking to the British government. It is hilarious that Hitler was making huge military decisions based on fan fiction, written by British agents. We literally controlled their eyes and ears for years. 70. Before he was the president, John F. Kennedy was just a young Navy guy stranded on an island. A Japanese destroyer sliced his PT boat in half and left his crew floating in the ocean for days. JFK swam to a tiny island and carved a rescue message into a coconut shell using his knife. He gave the coconut to 2 native islanders who paddled a canoe to find help for him. It actually worked, and the Navy came to rescue the future president. He kept that coconut on his desk in the Oval Office as a reminder that fruit can save your life. 71. The German battleship Scharnhorst was not just a warship, but apparently a floating haunted house that hated its own crew. It killed 9 workers during construction and then decapitated the captain with a defective gun turret. The sailors were convinced the ship was cursed because it kept crashing into other German ships and having freak accidents constantly. During its final battle, the survivors were left in the freezing water, and the rescue ship had to leave them because of a sudden ghost sighting. It seems the ship was fighting for the other team the whole time, and nobody knows why it was so evil. 72. The Soviet army had a brilliant idea to stop German tanks by strapping mines to hungry dogs. They trained the pups to run under tanks to find food, and then the mine would explode and destroy the enemy vehicle. The tragedy was they trained the dogs using Soviet diesel tanks, which smelled different than German gas tanks. In the real battle, the dogs got confused and ran back to the familiar-smelling Russian tanks instead. They ended up blowing up their own masters in a chaotic mess. It was a heartbreaking disaster that proved you should never weaponize a good boy. 73. Divers recently found a shipwreck in the Baltic Sea that was filled with hundreds of bottles of rare cognac. These fancy drinks were destined for Hermann Göring, who was the number 2 Nazi and loved living like a king. While his soldiers were freezing and starving on the front lines, he was busy importing luxury alcohol to get drunk in his castle. The bottles are still sealed and apparently drinkable if you have thousands of dollars to spend on evil booze. It just proves that corruption and greed were the only things the Nazis were actually good at organizing. 74. A British magician named Jasper Maskelyne decided to fight the war using smoke and mirrors instead of guns. He was tasked with hiding the Suez Canal, which was impossible to miss, so he built a dazzling light show. He used strobe lights and mirrors to create a spinning vortex of light that blinded German bomber pilots at night. The pilots were so confused by the disco lights that they dropped their bombs miles away in the empty desert. It was the biggest magic trick in history, and he made an entire vital harbor disappear without even using a wand. 75. You can't choose your family, but you can definitely choose to fight against them in a world war. William Patrick Hitler was the nephew of the German dictator, but he was born in England and hated his uncle. He moved to the United States and actually joined the US Navy to go fight against the Nazis. He served as a medic and was wounded in action while carrying a name that everyone else wanted to kill. It must have been awkward at roll call when the officer shouted his name and everyone turned around to look at the guy. 76. The story of the Struma is a heartbreaking mystery that shows how cold the world was during the war. A ship carrying nearly 800 Jewish refugees was stranded in Turkey because no country would let them land. After weeks of waiting, the Turks towed the broken ship out to the Black Sea and abandoned it without an engine. A Soviet submarine saw the helpless boat and torpedoed it for no reason, killing everyone except one survivor. The mystery lies in the massive political cover-up where every nation blamed the other for letting those innocent people drown alone. 77. The U.S. Navy wanted their sailors to see in the dark like vampires, so they issued weird red goggles. The idea was that wearing red lenses during the day would adapt their eyes to darkness for night watches. But the experiment went wrong when sailors started reporting strange hallucinations and psychological side effects from seeing a red world. They felt aggressive and depressed, and some guys just freaked out completely after staring at red walls for hours. The Navy realized that turning their crew into angry zombies was probably bad for morale, so they canceled the spooky eye program. 78. A massive Japanese submarine called the I-52 was on a secret mission to trade gold for German technology. It was carrying 2 tons of pure gold bars when American bombers sank it in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. In 1995, a treasure hunter actually found the wreck sitting 3 miles deep in the crushing darkness. He spent millions to reach it, but when they opened the cargo hold, the gold box was gone. Conspiracy theorists think the US government secretly recovered it years ago, or maybe the ocean floor just ate the fortune. The gold remains missing. 79. The Allies captured 10 top German nuclear scientists and locked them in a fancy house in England called Farm Hall. But the house was basically a reality TV show set because every room was bugged with microphones. The British listened to them for 6 months to see how close they were to building an atomic bomb. When the news broke that America had dropped the bomb on Japan, the German scientists were shocked and jealous. They started arguing and blaming each other for being too stupid to figure it out first. We literally recorded their egos falling apart. 80. You might think having a bad day is missing the bus, but Betty Lou Oliver had the worst day ever. She was working as an elevator operator in the Empire State Building when a B-25 bomber crashed into the 79th floor. She was injured, but rescuers put her in an elevator to get her to safety. Tragically, the crash had weakened the cables, and they snapped, sending her falling 75 stories to the basement. Miraculously, the piled-up cables cushioned the landing, and she survived the fall. She holds the world record for surviving the longest elevator fall. 81. There is a wild conspiracy theory that President Roosevelt actually died way before the war ended, and nobody told us. People claim that during the famous Yalta Conference, the man sitting in the chair was actually a look-alike actor. They point out that his behavior was super erratic, and he looked totally different in photos compared to a few months earlier. The weirdest part is that there was never a public autopsy performed on his body, which makes the tinfoil hat crowd go crazy. It sounds impossible, but imagine if we won the biggest war in history led by a guy who was just really good at improv. 82. You might think Hitler approved every weapon, but he actually banned the world's first assault rifle because he was stubborn. The German generals knew the STG-44 was an amazing gun, so they decided to lie to their boss to keep building it. They renamed it a machine pistol so Hitler would think it was just a tiny sidearm and ignore the paperwork. They developed the coolest gun of the war in total secret right under his nose. When Hitler finally saw it in action, he fell in love with it and asked why nobody told him sooner. It proves that sometimes you just have to ignore your boss. 83. The Florentine diamond was a massive yellow gem that belonged to the super-rich Austrian royal family for centuries. When the war started and chaos took over, the diamond was packed into a suitcase to be smuggled to safety. But somewhere between Austria and South America, the suitcase was stolen, and the diamond vanished into the black market. It was one of the most famous jewels in human history, and it has not been seen for 80 years. It was likely cut up into smaller stones and sold to people who have no idea they are wearing a stolen piece of history on their fingers. 84. The British military came up with a plan that sounds like it was written by a villain in a cartoon. They wanted to drop millions of linseed cakes infected with deadly anthrax spores onto German cattle fields. The goal was to wipe out the entire food supply by poisoning every cow in Germany to starve the enemy. They actually produced 5 million of these poison cakes and were ready to load the bombers when the war ended. If they had dropped them, the soil in Germany would still be toxic today. It was a terrifying plan that would have turned hamburgers into biological weapons. 85. Smoking is usually bad for your health, but For one lucky British soldier, it actually saved his life. He was fighting on the front lines when a German bullet smacked him right in the chest with lethal force. He should have died instantly, but the bullet slammed into a heavy silver cigarette case in his pocket. It dented the metal but stopped the lead from piercing his heart just days after he got it as a gift. He walked away with a nasty bruise instead of a funeral. It is the only time in history where a pack of smokes was actually the healthy choice. 86. Leslie Howard was a huge movie star from Gone with the Wind who vanished in a ball of fire. He was flying on a civilian plane from Portugal when a pack of Nazi junkers swarmed him and shot the plane down. The mystery is why the Germans would target a random passenger plane full of civilians. Most historians believe that German spies thought Winston Churchill was on board because his bodyguard looked like the Prime Minister. The Nazis murdered a movie star and innocent people just because they were bad at recognizing faces. It was a tragic case of mistaken identity at 10,000 feet. 87. The Soviet Union was in such a rush to build tanks that they started using trees instead of steel. Some early T-34 tanks were sent to the front line with wooden logs painted green to look like transmission covers. The German engineers who examined captured tanks were totally confused by the sloppy construction that somehow still worked. It turns out that when you have thousands of tanks, it does not matter if they are made of junk and held together by hope. The Russians proved that quantity has a quality all its own, even if that quality is just painted driftwood. 88. During the horrific firebombing of Dresden, the terrified locals tried to save their most precious treasures from the flames. The royal crown jewels of Saxony were hurriedly packed up and hidden in a secret location to avoid the looters. After the smoke cleared and the Russians arrived, some of the jewels were recovered, but many pieces were missing. The most valuable diamond of the collection vanished and is believed to have been stolen or melted down. It is sad to think that priceless art survived centuries of history, only to be lost because someone panicked during a fire drill and forgot where they put it. 89. Germany wanted to destroy the British economy without firing a single bullet by drowning them in fake cash. They forced Jewish prisoners who were master artists to engrave perfect plates for printing British pound notes. The counterfeits were so incredibly good that even the Bank of England could not tell the difference between them. The plan was to drop millions of these fake notes over London to make money worthless and cause a riot. They printed millions but never launched the attack, so the notes were dumped in a lake. It was the most expensive art project that was designed to make everyone poor. 90. You might love your legs, but you probably did not insure them for $1 million like the US military. Betty Grable was the most famous pinup girl of the war, and her photo was in every locker. The studio and the military decided her legs were a national treasure that boosted soldier morale, so they insured them. If she had broken a leg, it would have cost the insurance company a literal fortune in payouts. It sounds totally ridiculous, but her legs were considered as vital to the war effort as a tank or a plane. 91. Flying over the Himalayas was dangerous, but this story is just straight up spooky. A massive American transport plane disappeared in the mountains while flying the route called the Hump. The wreckage was hidden in the snow for 60 years until explorers finally found it. But the creepy part is what happened right after the crash. Radio operators at the base reported hearing frantic SOS signals coming from that plane for 3 whole days. The weather was freezing, and the crash was catastrophic, so nobody could have survived that long. It seems like the ghosts were tapping the keys to ask for help from beyond the icy grave. 92. The Nazis were getting so desperate by the end that they basically invented a suicide chair strapped to a firework. They built a plane called the Natter, which was made entirely of wood and glue because they had no metal left. It did not even have wheels because it launched straight up a pole like a bottle rocket. The pilot had to shoot his missiles at the bombers and then immediately eject because the plane was designed to break apart. It was a manned missile that required the pilot to have zero fear of death and a lot of trust in plywood carpentry. 93. Imagine finding a cave full of medieval gold and deciding to just mail it home like a birthday present. An American soldier named Joe Meter found a hidden stash of priceless church art in Germany and stole it. He didn't use a smuggler, he just wrapped the gold and jewels in plain brown paper and mailed them to his local hardware store in Texas. He kept the loot in his closet for decades and sometimes showed it to neighbors at barbecues. The theft was only discovered after he died, and his family tried to sell the stolen history on the black market. 94. The U.S. Navy was terrified of German spies blowing up the docks in New York, so they hired the criminals. They made a secret deal with the most powerful mobster in prison named Lucky Luciano. The government basically asked the Godfather to tell his goons to protect the waterfront from Nazis. In exchange for a lighter prison sentence, Luciano also helped the army invade Sicily by contacting his old mafia buddies on the island. It was the only time in history where the good guys and the bad guys teamed up to fight the even worse guys. 95. Calvin Graham was a tough American hero who won a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart for his bravery in combat. The only problem was that he was 12 years old and should have been in middle school. He stole a notary stamp and forged his mother's signature to join the Navy because he looked older than he was. He fought in major battles until his mom finally wrote a letter to the Navy telling on him. Instead of a parade, the military threw the kid in a prison cell for lying. He was the real-life Doogie Howser of war. 96. People have spent years scanning Loch Ness with sonar looking for a prehistoric dinosaur monster. But instead of finding a plesiosaur, they found a giant Wellington bomber sitting on the muddy bottom. The plane had crashed during a training run on New Year's Eve in 1940 and sank into the deep, dark water. It was perfectly preserved by the cold peat and looked like it had just landed there yesterday. It turns out the only monster hiding in the famous lake was a war machine built by humans. Nessie must have been hiding behind the wings the whole time. 97. We think smart bombs are a modern invention, but the Nazis actually built a video game weapon in 1943. They created the Fritz X, which was a massive bomb with little wings and a radio receiver. A guy in the bomber plane would use a little joystick to steer the bomb while it was falling to hit a moving target. They used it to sink the Italian battleship Roma, and the Allies were totally terrified. We had no way to stop it because we didn't know how to jam the radio signals. It was a guided missile before computers even existed. 98. The Nazis were so confident they would conquer Britain that they wrote a hit list before the invasion even started. It was called the Black Book, and it contained the names of nearly 3,000 people to be arrested immediately. The list included Winston Churchill and famous writers and even the head of the Boy Scouts. If your name was in that book, you were destined for a firing squad or a prison camp. It is chilling to think that a bureaucrat sat at a desk typing up a list of who would die as soon as the Germans landed. 99. The American generals were secretly terrified that the Germans would use radioactive sand on the beaches of D-Day. They launched Operation Peppermint to prepare for a nuclear dirty bomb attack before the atomic bomb was even public. They gave medical teams Geiger counters and special film to detect radiation, but told them it was for poison gas. The soldiers hit the beaches worrying about bullets, while the top brass worried about invisible death rays. It shows just how scared the Allies were of Nazi science, even if that science did not actually exist yet. 100. Most soldiers pick a side, but Laurie Torney just really loved fighting against communists no matter who paid him. He started as a Finnish soldier fighting the Soviets, and then joined the Nazi SS when Finland lost. He fought for the Germans until the war ended, and he was arrested for treason. But he escaped and moved to America, where he joined the U.S. Army Green Berets. He ended up dying in a helicopter crash in Vietnam while fighting communists again. He is the only guy to have 3 different flags on his resume and be a hero to all of them. 101. The U.S. Navy actually sent a slow-floating balloon to fight a heavily armed German submarine, which sounds like a terrible idea. Blimp K-74 spotted a U-boat off the coast of Florida and decided to attack it with a tiny machine gun. The U-boat captain probably laughed before shooting the blimp out of the sky with his massive deck gun. The crew survived, but the weird part is what happened to the evidence later. The German captain took photos of the burning blimp, and those photos were surprisingly found in a bunker years later. It remains the only time a spaceship-looking balloon lost a gunfight to a boat. 102. Hitler had a serious problem with overcompensating because he built the biggest gun in human history. The Schwere Gustav was a railway gun so massive it needed its own train tracks and 2,000 men just to set it up. It fired shells that weighed 7 tons, which is basically shooting a school bus at the enemy. The gun was so loud it shattered windows for miles, and the recoil was like an earthquake. It was totally impractical because it took days to aim and reload. The Allies never even bothered to bomb it because it was just a giant waste of German steel. 103. When the American soldiers of the 101st Airborne captured Hitler's private mountain home, they stopped acting like soldiers. They discovered a secret cave filled with thousands of bottles of rare wine and silver stamped with the Nazi swastika. Instead of reporting the loot, the guys decided to have the biggest party of the war. They drank vintage champagne and stuffed their bags with silverware and expensive paintings. To this day, you can find American families with Hitler's personal forks in their kitchen drawers. It was the ultimate finders keepers moment where the guys who beat the bad guys took all their fancy dinnerware. 104. The US military really thought they could win the war by using a giant glowing cartoon character. Project Fantasia was a plan to project a massive holographic image of the Buddha onto the clouds over Japan. They wanted to scare the religious population into surrendering by making them think their god was angry. The scientists realized that clouds are not movie screens, and the technology was just not ready for a laser show. It sounds like a bad prank, but the generals were ready to spend millions to turn the sky into a drive-in movie theater to spook the enemy. 105. Joe Medicine Crow went to war not just to fight Nazis, but to complete a legendary checklist. He was a Native American who wanted to become a war chief, which required touching an enemy and stealing a horse. He actually managed to sneak into a German camp and steal 50 horses while singing a traditional war song. He also knocked a German soldier down and took his rifle without killing him. He is the only person to become a tribal war chief by fighting in World War II. He basically turned the war into his own personal video game achievement run. 106. There are shipwrecks, and then there are complete disappearances that defy all the laws of physics. The SS Paul Hamilton was carrying high explosives and 580 men when a torpedo hit it. In less than 30 seconds, the entire ship just vaporized in a mushroom cloud that shook the ocean floor. The explosion was so violent that when rescue ships arrived, they found absolutely nothing but empty water. There was no wood and no bodies and no debris anywhere. It was like the ship was erased from existence by a giant eraser, leaving scientists baffled by the total destruction. 107. The Nazis realized they could not drive across the ocean, so they tried to drive underneath it. They invented the Tauchpanzer, which was a regular tank sealed with rubber, and given a long snorkel hose. The plan was to drop them off the boats and have them drive on the seafloor to surprise the British on the beach. They tested it, and the tanks actually worked underwater like creepy metal crabs. But the invasion was canceled, so these submarine tanks were just used to cross rivers instead. It is terrifying to imagine looking at the ocean and seeing a tank drive out. 108. The Krupp family made billions building cannons for Hitler, but their favorite rock ended up in Hollywood. They owned a massive 33-carat diamond that was the envy of the world. After the war, the ring was sold off and eventually bought by Richard Burton for his wife Elizabeth Taylor. It is wild to think that the most famous diamond in American pop culture was bought with money made from Nazi weapons. The ring traveled from the dark heart of the German war machine to the red carpet in Los Angeles. It is a sparkly piece of history with a very dirty past. 109. The British hired an actor to win the war because he looked exactly like General Montgomery. This poor guy named Clifton James had to give up his job and learn to walk and talk like the famous general. They sent him to Gibraltar to walk around and smoke cigars so German spies would see him. The Nazis thought the real general was in the Mediterranean while he was actually in England planning D-Day. The actor was terrified the whole time that a sniper would shoot him. He literally risked his life to play the role of a lifetime without a script. 110. Sometimes the weather changes history, and at Dunkirk, the ocean decided to save the British Army. 300,000 soldiers were trapped on the beach, waiting to be slaughtered by the Germans. But suddenly, the English Channel became perfectly flat and calm for 9 days straight. Meteorologists calculated the odds of this weather pattern happening as millions to one. This miracle allowed tiny fishing boats and private yachts to cross the water and rescue the boys. It was like the ocean itself wanted to help the good guys escape the trap. Even the atheists were looking at the sky and saying thank you. 111. There is a mysterious safe sitting in the basement of the Hôtel de Paris in Monaco that nobody opens. It was left there by Nazi officers who were fleeing the city as the Allies approached. Rumors say it is filled with stolen gold or documents that could change history, or maybe just dirty laundry. But the hotel staff is terrified that the safe is booby-trapped with explosives to kill anyone who touches it. To this day, it sits there gathering dust because nobody is brave enough to crack the code. It is the ultimate cliffhanger that has been waiting 80 years. We just proved that World War II was basically a chaotic reality show with tanks. So here's the big question. Would you rather fight a bear carrying artillery or eat a chocolate bar that blows your head off? Let me know in the comments. Smash that like button and subscribe to Dumb History right now so you never miss the madness. And do not click off yet, because the video on your screen is even crazier than the ghost blimp. Click it now and I will see you there.